Good morning, grade 12s. My name is Grace Mwepang, your teacher for life sciences today. And the topic that we're going to focus on is human nervous system. Then we'll go through this. And then at the end of the lesson, this lesson, you should be able to define terminologies. You should be able to know the different parts of the nervous system. You should be able to identify the different structures of the brain and the spinal cord. You should be able to describe the functions of the part of the brain. And again, you should be able to draw and label the parts of the neuron. You should be able to label the reflex arc and describe its function. Be able to differentiate between reflex arc and reflex action, and briefly be able to explain the events occurring during reflex action. So, all those outcomes that I've put down, they are directed by the exam guideline. Remember, we're not just studying everything according to the textbooks that you are using. We are directed by the exam guideline. This topic of human nervous system, it's on page 10 of the exam guideline. So what is the exam guideline saying? The nervous system, as I said, that it's the topic that we're going to deal with today. Is the process that allows human beings to be able to respond to the environment. But the body cannot just respond to the environment using the nerves. Also, the endocrine system is involved in this case. But today, we're only dealing with the nerves for the body to be able to respond to the environment. So our exam guideline says the nervous system. The need for a nervous system in humans, the reaction to the stimuli, that is, stimuli can be external and internal, and the coordination of various activities in the body. The exam guidelines continues to say, under the central nervous system, we're talking the brain and the spinal cord, and the protection, which is the meninges. You need to know the location and the function of the brain. And if we look at the brain here, the only part that you need to study is the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the corpus callosum, medulla oblongata. Remember, in your textbooks, you've got different parts of the brain that are labeled, but the examiners just expect you to know only these four. Then you have to know the spinal cord as part of the central nervous system. Then exam guideline continues to page 11. The subunit of the human nervous system, peripheral nervous system. You need to know the location and the function of the peripheral nervous system. And autonomic nervous system. And you need to know the location and the function of the autonomic nervous system, where now you'll be studying the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system that are working antagonistically to each other to control the organ and the glands. Then, still, our exam guideline on the same page 11, you need to know the control. You need to know control involuntary events, sympathetic nerves that generally stimulate response, whereas the parasympathetic nerves that generally inhibit. The previous page said we're looking at this parasympathetic and sympathetic as working antagonistically. So if you look at this one, it says we're going to learn where the parasympathetic nerve and generally inhibits the response and the sympathetic stimulate the response. That is the outline of our exam guideline that you should always have when you study. With you, this document should always be there so that you should not depend on what is there in the textbooks, because the textbooks are written by different authors and they're having a lot of information that is not outlined in our exam guideline. Thank you. Then, let's hit the road now. For life sciences, to be able to master life sciences, Under human nervous system, these are the terminologies that you need to master for you to master every content based on human nervous system. Terminologies are central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. The definitions of these terminologies, you are going to get them while we're going through it with our content. Autonomic nervous system, sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, axon, synapse, multiple sclerosis, and Alzheimer's diseases. Those are the terminologies that you should make sure that at the end of this content, you are able to define them. Let's get into nervous system. I put here a flow chart to summarize or to outline what human nervous system is. Human nervous system it has got two sections, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. It is divided into the subunits. Then, if we're talking about the central nervous system here, we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord. The content will continue with it. Then the second part of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system also is divided into the sensory pathway and the motor pathway. We're not dealing with the sensory pathway. Remember, we dealt with our exam guideline. We're looking at the motor pathway, where now the motor pathway has got the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Again, we're only concentrating on the autonomic nervous system for our content this year. And autonomic nervous system has got two pathways also that controls the autonomic nervous system. Once you hear the word auto, it means it can action on its own. Then the autonomic nervous system is divided into two pathways, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Fine. Our exam guideline, grade 12s, remember I said when you start, you should always have your exam guideline with you. Then it said you should learn the functions of the nervous system. So this diagram here, the flow chart here, explains, it summarizes the function of the nervous system. I said human nervous system helps the body to respond to the environment. And what is there in the environment? The environment consists of so many stimuli. So for the body to respond to those stimuli, we need the sense organ. Like you see the first block here, we're talking the stimulus. But stimulus, singular, plural, stimuli. Singular, plural, stimulus. And then singular, it's stimuli. Then in the environment, we've got those different stimuli. Then we need our receptors to receive the stimuli from the environment. The receptors in this case, the word receptor, to receive. Then how do we receive the stimuli? The sense organs. So hence our sense organs, we refer them as our receptors. So the receptor will receive the stimuli, and the stimuli now, once it lands into the neuron, we no longer call it a stimuli now, we call it an impulse. Then we've got the sensory neuron from the sense organ that receives the stimuli, and then the stimuli converted into an impulse that will be transmitted by the sensory neuron. Sensory from the word sense, organs, then the sensory neuron will transmit the information from the receptor to the central nervous system. In the central nervous system, that's where processing will take place. Then after processing has taken place, we need to respond. Like I said, a nervous system helps the body to respond to the environment. Then the impulse has been processed. After being processed, response needs to take place. then how is response going to take place? Then we've got another type of a neuron that will transmit the processed impulse for response to take place. Then the motor neuron will transmit the impulse to the effector. Effector in this case, because now we're talking the nervous system, will be the muscles. Then from grade 11, from grade 10, you know that the muscles are important for movement. So once the impulse is transmitted into the effector, being the muscles, then movement will be there. The movement will be our response. Hence I said, the human nervous system help the body to respond to the environment. Grade 12, up to now you understand that we're now looking at the central nervous system. We said the human nervous system consists of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So we start unpacking central nervous system, which now we say central nervous system is made up of brain and spinal cord. Now that the exam guidelines said we should know the structure and the function and the position, we look at the brain first. If you look at the diagrams on the diagrams here, we've got the external structure of the brain and the internal structure of the brain. So if you look at this brain, the external structure of your brain, I would say it's the external structure of the brain. We're not studying anything in the external, but we need to know every part. Remember the exam guideline. It outlined only 4 parts that you need to know on the brain. Now, the second diagram the second diagram here is the internal structure of the brain. Now, if you look at the external structure of the brain and the internal structure of the brain, I would say if you you put together your fist, you've got a complete external structure of the brain. Now we're looking at the internal, is the transverse section of the brain. Now, the brain consists of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. I know it's not outlined in the exam guideline, but to understand it better, we need to talk to the left-hand hemisphere and the left-hand hemisphere and the right-hand hemisphere. So if I put my fist like this, I've got the external structure of the brain. When I take out this fist, then we look at this fist. You can take example of this fist as your internal structure of your brain. I'm doing this so that you should remember this thumb. We're going to talk to this thumb. So let's look at this internal structure of our brain. The thumb here, on the fist here, I'll take it as this part. Let me go back a bit. I'll take this thumb as this part of the brain. Initially I put my fist together to say we're talking our left-hand hemisphere and our right-hand hemisphere. Then we cut our brain across. Then we've got the transverse section of the brain. We ended up with this. So my thumb here, you should remember to identify it with this part of your brain, this part of your brain. Then you will remember. Then you see we've got this part. You will refer it to this part of your hand, and this will be the back part of your brain. This will be the bigger part, the largest part of your brain. Now let's look at this internal structure of the brain. We've got the internal structure of the brain, functions, and the parts. The first part that we're looking at, remember the thumb that I talked to? This thumb, it's this, look at this part. You will remember that now you're talking the corpus callosum. So what would be the function of the corpus callosum? Because initially our brain was like this, we cut our brain across. Then we see the corpus callosum. So we'll say the function of the corpus callosum here, it joined the left-hand hemisphere of the brain and the right-hand hemisphere of the brain. So if it joins these two, it will definitely be important for communication between the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the brain. That would be the function of the corpus callosum. Let's look at the second part of the brain. We've got the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, now we go back to the fist. The hypothalamus, you'll relate it to this part of your fist. We've got the hypothalamus here. And what are the functions of the hypothalamus? The exam guideline did outline that we need to know the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is situated just above the pituitary, the pituitary gland. So the function of the hypothalamus, it controls the pituitary gland. I know in the exam guideline, pituitary gland was not there, but when I introduced the lesson, I said the body responds to the environment using the chemicals or hormones and the nerves. So hence I put this pituitary gland here and then say the hypothalamus controls the functioning of the pituitary gland. Again, the hypothalamus here, as it's here, hypothalamus, it regulates hunger and it regulates the thirst, it regulates your emotions and the body temperature. So if we look at the hypothalamus, for you to remember, because you have to know this, if you start with regulating the hypothalamus, important for regulation of hunger, at least already you have one function there. Then the age, you relate it to hunger. Then you will remember the body temperature, you will remember the thirst, because hunger goes together with drinking. So if it regulates hunger, you'll remember when you eat, most of the people, when they eat, they also drink. Then it regulates the thirst. That is the function of the hypothalamus. We move to the next part of the brain. So this part of the brain, for you to remember it, it looks like a leaf. It's a leaf-like structure at the back part of your brain. So you remember a leaf-like structure, smaller part here of the brain. Then it is called the cerebellum. It's long for the smaller part of the brain. So what is the function of the cerebellum? Cerebellum, where it is important for balance and coordination of voluntary movements. Coordination of voluntary movements, if I can give an example. If you are maybe a netball player, you look at your teammate, and on the left-hand side, again, you look at your teammate, and then your teammate will throw a ball to you. You are looking at the ball. You're going to catch the ball. The eye is on the ball, and you're going to turn and pass the ball to your teammate. You're not falling. You're still balancing, and your eye and your functioning of your hand and the eye are coordinated by the cerebellum. And again, your balance. And again, because now we're talking the balance and coordination and the coordination of the voluntary movement. So again, the cerebellum is important for muscle tone. Let's move to the next one. We've got the medulla oblongata. Remember grade 12s. Medulla oblongata, because I'm trying to put it in a way that you'll be able to remember. The medulla oblongata is just below the solen part of the brain, which is referred to as the pons. We don't have it in our exam guideline, but you'll remember just below the solen part. Then we've got the medulla oblongata, so that you should not mix it or confuse it with the spinal cord that is coming. Then you've got the medulla oblongata. The medulla oblongata, the positioning of it, it tells you, it transmits the impulse to the brain. That's the function. And it controls the involuntary actions. Remember, the cerebellum coordinated voluntary actions. Medulla oblongata controls the involuntary actions. Involuntary actions, I can give an example of the heart rate. You don't control your heart rate. Digestion of food inside your stomach, you cannot tell the stomach, now it's time, I've eaten. eating food, you can digest. It's just happening. So those are the involuntary actions that are controlled by the medulla oblongata. We move to pituitary gland. I've already talked to the pituitary gland. I said I put pituitary gland because the hypothalamus controls its functioning. And again, because the pituitary gland is important again to allow the body to respond to the environment, but in this case, it's when the body responds to the environment using the chemicals or the hormones. This is a topic on its own. It will follow. Then we're looking at the last part, the largest part of your brain. Well, now we call it the cerebrum. With life sciences, terminology can be confusing. So if you look at number 6, it's cerebrum, short, the bigger, the largest part of your brain. Cerebellum, the smallest part of your brain, that is a leaf-like structure. The cerebrum here, largest part of your brain, controls so many activities here. The cerebrum controls the voluntary action. You'll say, somewhere at grade 12, you said, but you talk to voluntary actions. I said coordination of voluntary actions in the cerebellum. In the cerebrum, it's the control of the voluntary actions. If I want to talk, I'll talk. If I don't want to talk, I won't talk. Coordination, the words should come as they're supposed to. It's coordinated by the cerebellum. Cerebrum here now, we are at the function of the cerebrum. I'm taking cerebrum and cerebellum because of the names that can be confusing. So we say here, in the cerebrum, we've got coordination, we've got control of the voluntary actions. And then again, that's where the sensations are interpreted. What are sensations? What are you talking about? Sensations is interpretation of the stimuli from that were received by the sense organs, hence says sensations. For an example, the smell of Nando's. I use my nose to smell. Then for me to say it's Nando's, it's interpreted in the cerebrum. Then the cerebrum again, that's where the high thoughts are there. What are the high thoughts that I'm talking about? Your intelligence, your memory. All those high thoughts, your judgments are all interpreted in the biggest part of your brain. Up to there, grade 12, I think you now understand the structure of the brain and the functions of the 4 parts that are outlined in the exam guideline. Let's move now. We're still under central nervous system because we said it consists of the brain and the spinal cord. We dealt with the brain, we unpacked the brain, we did the function, the parts, and everything. Now we move to the spinal cord. If you look at the spinal cord, we see these, the vertebrae, we see them when we eat meat and when we eat meat. These are the bones that protects the spinal cord. Remember in the exam guideline, it talked to the protection of the both central nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord are protected by bones, and they are protected by 3 layers that are referred to as the meninges. In the spinal cord, we still have the 3rd protection here. We've got the cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is found in the center of the gray matter of the spinal cord. The center where we find the cerebral fluid is called it's in the center of the gray matter. The gray matter is this H-shaped part of the spinal cord. And around the spinal cord, around the gray matter, we've got the white matter. And we've got the spinal nerves here in the spinal cord. And the spinal cord has got the top part that is referred to as the dorsal part, and the back part is referred to as the ventral part of the spinal cord. And then we've got the ventral root at the bottom part. We've got the ventral root at the top part. We've got the ventral horn at the bottom part and the dorsal horn at the top part. So if you look at this, it's the summary of this. And what is happening in the spinal cord? In the spinal cord, we've got with the action that is taking place in the spinal cord, we call it the reflex action. And when we looked at our outcomes, we said we should know what reflex action is and what a reflex arc is. Then when we continue with the spinal cord, we'll be able to see the difference between reflex arc and reflex action. Let's look at the questions, possible questions that can be asked based on the central nervous system. Then when you answer the questions, grade 12, this question is taken from DBE November 2019, paper 1, because the human nervous system is part of paper 1, and remember it's 40 marks. It's written in the exam guideline. So this is the question from November 2019, paper 1. When answering questions, once you see the diagram, the instruction says the diagram below shows some parts of the human central nervous system. Already, when you see human central nervous system, what runs in your brains at this time? It says now it should be the brain and the spinal cord. Then, before you even go to the questions, please study the diagram. Try to label all the parts that are given in the diagram before you read the questions. It's important to study the diagram. So we see the diagram here, we are given the brain and the spinal cord. And if we can start studying this, we look at this. We said the bigger part, it's the short name, cerebrum. We said the smaller part, that sound almost like the bigger part, is the cerebellum, long name for the smaller part. Then, remember the thumb? We see the structure that looks like the thumb. Then we know now we're talking the corpus callosum. We said we've got the structure just below the solemn part of the brain. So immediately when you see this, you know you're talking to medulla oblongata. Then it means just after medulla oblongata is the spinal cord. We studied the diagram, then we can read the questions. It says identify part A. For A, you identify part A, you identify part C. We already definitely identified the part. Let's see whether we were correct when we were dealing with our identification or labeling. Let's see. Part A there, we said it. It's spinal cord, just below the medulla oblongata. Then they say you should identify C. Where is C? C, remember the thumb? We said it's corpus callosum. Let's see whether we are correct. It's corpus callosum. Do you see now, grade 12s, how important it is to study the diagram first before you start reading the questions? Let's continue with questions still based in the same diagram. The next question says you write down letter. I bolded this, and name. Please, grade 12, make sure that you write the letter and the name. If the question says, write down letter and name of what? Part that has center for interpreting taste. Remember we talked to the sensations? So the part will be small, short name for the bigger part. Let's see whether we are right. Cerebrum, the letter will be D, the bigger part, and the name will be the cerebrum. Then the next one, the part that regulates the heart rate. Involuntary, remember we talked to the involuntary actions. And then when we were talking about the involuntary actions, we gave an example of the heart rate. We were talking about the part that is just below the solemn part. Let's see whether we are right. Medulla oblongata, that's correct. What is the letter for that? It's B. Next one, the part that is responsible for motor coordination. what would be that part? And then you start thinking, motor, when we are talking about the response, we talk about the movement. Movement is voluntary. Let's see whether we are right when we're talking about the voluntary. But there's the smaller part with the long name, and the letter is E, the name is cerebellum, long name. Then you see, grade 12s. From the questions that we're dealing with, it's so important to study the diagram before you answer the question. Now we move to the second part of human nervous system. We said we've got the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Then the peripheral nervous system, the word peripheral. You look at the suffix, the prefix peri means around or outside. So here, we were dealing with the nerves, the nerves with the central nervous system in the middle. Now we're talking about those ones that are around, because we cannot be just concentrating on the spinal cord and the brain. We still have parts that need to coordinate with the brain, the central nervous system. Hence, we've got these nerves outside. They are outside. These nerves, hence they are called the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system is divided into autonomic system. The word auto, once you hear that sound auto means can do it on itself. We've got the automatic car where you don't have to take your gear to 1 or 2, 3. You just put on drive, then you drive. Then we call that car, we call it automatic. We've got the machines that we use for dishes, and they are automatic. You don't do anything. You put on, it does everything. Yours is just to take out the washing in the machine. Then the autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary actions. So the involuntary actions, like I given an example already. We're talking about the functioning of the lungs you don't control, the functioning of the lung, the heart rate you don't control, the digestion you don't control. All those are the involuntary actions that are controlled by autonomic nervous system. So autonomic nervous system, like we said at the beginning when we outlined this section, we said autonomic nervous system is further divided into 2 sets of nerves. Why 2 sets? Remember, the human nervous system is important to help the body to respond to the environment. Then all those automatic nervous system are controlled by 2 sets of nerves that work antagonistically, opposite to each other. So the diagram here shows the autonomic nervous system that consists of the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. Shoo, ma'am. Parasympathetic, sympathetic. Sympathetic, remember, sympathetic to have that sympathy. If you have sympathy, you will forever protect. So that's how you can remember this. The parasympathetic always is there it stimulates the functioning. Stimulation for example that I can give you now, I'm busy teaching you, you are concentrating, you have your pen and pencil, you are taking notes and you're doing everything. All of a sudden you hear a loud noise. Then you cannot say, hey, there's a loud noise. You'll jump. Once you jump, now we are talking about the sympathetic nervous system that is there for fight, fly, and fright. You are now frightened. Then immediately when you are frightened, then what is going to happen? The heart rate will increase. The blood flow will increase to your muscle so that more energy can go to your muscle for you to do what? To run. Then immediately you will run for protection. That's the sympathetic nervous system that is in action at that time. So you heard a loud noise, you just ran away. Then immediately you realize, it was just a balloon. Then, shoo, you pause. Now, what comes in there? The parasympathetic, remember the P, you pause. Now, you relax. The body goes back to normal. The heart rate now comes back to normal. The arteries are now constricting because they dilated for the amount of blood that was flown to the muscles. Then you relax. That is the antagonistic way of functioning of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Remember, sympathetic to protect. For you to be protected, you have to run. And then for you to feel you are now safe, you pause. And then the body comes back to normal. Let's look at this diagram. This diagram explains exactly the functioning of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Now we've got it. I'll take the first example. I've given an example of the heart rate. So let's take an example, the first example there. In the sympathetic, we've got the eye that dilates. You are in the dark, you are alone. The eyes are like, you are looking around, am I safe here? The people now dilates. Then, all of a sudden, there's lightning. You are sure you are safe. What will happen to your people? The people will now dilate because of this light, and then still your body, it's normal. You are no longer about to run away or not sure what is going on around you. You are now at rest, you've paused. The parasympathetic comes in. All these organs, the parasympathetic will forever inhibit. The sympathetic will forever stimulate. That is the antagonistic functioning of parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So I put it in a diagram so that you can see all those functioning of parasympathetic and sympathetic. Then this is just a summary of this diagram that I put here before. So if you look at this, I just put it in words. We're looking at the heart rate. The sympathetic will increase the heart rate as the example that I've given. And then what will happen to what will the parasympathetic do? The parasympathetic now will decrease the heart rate when you feel you are safe or you are relaxed or for the body to come back to normal. Then the parasympathetic relaxes. The sympathetic relaxes the whole of the bladder. The parasympathetic does what? Contracts. Then dilation of the impulse with the sympathetic constriction. So you see, we talk to the antagonistic functioning, and we talk to stimulation and inhibiting. So this stimulates, dilates the arteries for more blood to be pumped to the muscles when you are frightened. Then when you feel you are safe, then the arteries will constrict to take the body back to normal. This one increases, the sympathetic increases blood pressure, and then the parasympathetic will decrease. So that's where we see the antagonistic function, the opposite function of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. That was the first part of our exam guideline, looking at the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Our exam guideline still continues under human nervous system. Now we need to know the structure and functioning of the nerve. Function of the sensory and motor neuron. I bolded that so that you should remember. Then you need to know the structure again and the functions of part of the two neurons that I referred to. Using the diagram, meaning there, in the question paper, you will forever expect a diagram to be there. But we've got only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 parts of the 6 parts of the neuron that you need to study. It's not the only labels, but it's for examination this year in grade 12. But in the textbooks, like I said, the textbooks put all the labels. Don't concentrate on other labels. Concentrate on the 6 labels that are outlined in the exam guideline. Remember, the exam guideline should always form part of your documents that you are using when you study, because you cannot study the textbook. Otherwise, you won't get anything. You won't understand anything because it's just a big book So follow the exam guideline using the exam guide, your textbooks and the other resources that you are using. But the exam guideline should guide you on what to study and how to study so that you can be able to answer the questions based on those sections. It continues our exam guideline. When we started, we talked to the reflex. We did talk to the reflex arc and reflex action when we were looking at the structure of the spinal cord. So what are you expected to know? The definition, I said terminology is key at the beginning. So you need to know the definition of reflex action and reflex arc. And for me, again, you have to be able to differentiate between the two. Again, you need to know the structure of the reflex arc and function of each part using the diagram. Remember this, the parts that you need to know in the spinal cord. Again, the diagrams you'll be using, you need to know the receptors, sensory neuron, the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, the spinal cord, interneuron, motor neuron, ventral root of the spinal nerve, and the effector. When I outlined at the beginning, you still remember all these words where I did talk to them when I outlined this topic. Again, you need to know the functioning of simple reflex action using an example. And you need to know the significance of this action. And you need to know the significance of the synapses. And possibly you should know what synapses is. Then, after studying the human nervous system, you need to know the disorders that are related to the central nervous system. And you need to know the disorders, the causes, the symptoms of which disorders. We cannot study all the disorders. You're only concentrating on the two. You're looking at the causes and the symptoms of what? Of the Alzheimer's disease and multiple sclerosis. These are the only two disorders that we need to study for this year to pass your matric grade 12s. Structure of the neuron, as the exam guideline guided us to know the structure of the neuron. This is a simple structure of a neuron. So if you look at this neuron, we said we're studying only the parts that are indicated in the exam guideline. In the exam guideline, you need to know the cell body. You can see the cell body. And you need to know the cytoplasm. You know the cell from grade 10. In the cytoplasm now, again, you need to know the nucleus. That is label number 3. Then the dendrites. Then you need to know the myelin sheath that covers or insulates the axon. Axons, that is the pathway for the impulse. These are the only labels that you need to know their functions in the structure of the neurons, according to our exam guideline. Grade 12s, for us as human beings to respond to the environment, we said we need the nervous system. So that response now, the impulse that I talked to at the beginning of the lesson, that need to be, it comes first as a stimuli and then converted to impulse, and impulse moving through the sensory neuron to the central nervous system, processing taking place, and then response need to take place when now the impulse after processing is transmitted by the motor neuron to the effector, and then a response to take place. This is what we are talking to. Now, the types of neurons that are involved in that process are these neurons, 3 neurons. They are outlined in the exam guideline. We've got the sensory neuron. Remember, I said once you hear this, you relate it to your sense organs. It means this is the neuron that transmits impulse from your sense organs to the central nervous system. In the central nervous system, then we've got the interneuron that connects the sensory neuron and the motor neuron, where now processing is taking place, and then the transmission of impulse again from the cell body to the dendrites of or cell body to the dendrites of the motor neuron, where now we've got the terminal point that goes to your effector so that a response can take place. In this case, we gave an example of effector as our muscles. So this is how these neurons are working together. So these are the sensory neuron. You look at it, it's a unipolar. This can be multipolar, and motor neuron is a multipolar neuron. Then the sensory neuron transmit impulse from the sense organs to the central nervous system. And the interneuron connects, transmit the impulse from the sensory neuron to the motor neuron. So a motor neuron will transmit impulse from the central nervous system to the effector. The direction is opposite. From the sensory organ to the central nervous system, from the central nervous system to the effector for response to take place. That is this diagram that is I put here. Then each and every part of this you need to know the functions. So let's move now. Before we go to this diagram, let's look at the functions of this. We've got the axion. That is the pathway of the impulse. That's where the impulse is traveling. The impulse is traveling in a form of electric current. Then where they joined here, they don't even touch each other. And I think this one will explain it better. This diagram will explain the movement or transmission of impulse better than that. This is the terminal part of the axion. Axion being the pathway for the impulse in a form of electric current. Here we've got the mitochondria to give, the function of the mitochondria is for energy. So we've got the terminal part of the axion, and then the impulse needs to be transmitted to the dendrite of another neuron. Here, the terminal part of the neuron, of the axion, to the dendrites. Then, where this is taking place, where the transmission of impulse is taking place, we've got a space here. Meaning the neurons do not touch each other. The terminal part of the axion and the next dendrites of another neuron, they don't touch each other. We've got a space here. This space, we call it the synaptic gap. What is happening in the synaptic gap? This part is where what we call the synapse. Synapse is the point where impulse is transmitted from the terminal part of the axion to the dendrites of another neuron. So we call the point where transmission is taking place, we call it the synapse. And the space is called the synaptic gap. So we've got the neurotransmitters that transmit the impulse from the terminal to the dendrites of this. So these neurotransmitters help the impulse to be transmitted from this neuron to another neuron. And I said we've got the mitochondria here just to give energy to for the transmission of the impulse by these neurotransmitters. The textbook has got information that tells the type of proteins here. It's not in the exam guideline. You just have to understand that we've got the part where the transmission is taking place is called the synapse, and the gap is the synaptic gap, and the transmission is done by the neurotransmitters. And transmission is from the terminal point of the axion to the dendrite of another neuron. Now let's move. Reflex arc. In our exam guideline, we said you should understand the functioning and what the reflex action arc is. The reflex arc is the pathway of the impulse that is interpreted in the spinal cord. So it's just a pathway where the impulse is moving and then interpreted in the spinal cord. Then it brings about reflex action, immediate action, quick reaction. Remember, we are responding to environment or to the stimuli from the environment. In this case, we're now talking of that quick response. If you smell the smell of you smelling nice food, you don't need to respond quickly. So it is interpreted in the brain. In this case now, this diagram will outline and give you the clear understanding why we're talking of the reflex action as the quick response to the stimuli. So why quick response? The importance of the reflex action is to protect the body against severe damage or injury. Hence, quickly, hence interpreted in the spinal cord. So let's look at this diagram that is giving us the example of the reflex action. We've got the finger here that has got the skin that will serve as the receptor. It receives. Then we've got the flame from the candle, which now gives out heat. Then if you put your finger on the flame, definitely you're going to feel the pain. Then the stimulus here is its heat. Then when it gets into the neuron, it's now converted into the impulse. Then the impulse is transmitted from the sensory organ through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. I emphasize from and to. From the sense organ to the spinal cord. And the impulse is transmitted by the sensory because it is from the sense organ. Then it will travel, transmitted from the sense organ to the spinal cord. Then it will enter through the dorsal part of your spinal cord. Then in the gray matter, then we've got the interneuron. When now we say the interneuron connects the motor and the sensory neuron. Then transmission of impulse will take place here, where now we know we've got the synapse. And then we've got neurotransmission of impulse. Now processing is taking place, and then the transmission now will be from the cell body of the interneuron to the terminal of the axon. And it now comes to the motor neuron. That will now take the impulse from the center, from the spinal cord to, look at the blue line, to the effector. Effector here is the muscle. Then the muscles are important for movement. Then immediately the hand will be removed from the surface that is hot. That is reflex action. You react immediately because this is too hot. You cannot say, I'm feeling hot. Can I take this hand from? No, it just happened immediately. So you just remove your hand. That's the reflex action, the pathway. It's taking place in the spinal cord, in the reflex arc. I believe you understand now the difference between the reflex arc and the reflex action. Then we're going to deal with the multiple choice question type. So we know in our question paper, section A consists of 50 marks that will mostly consist of terminology. So for you to be able to answer multiple choice questions, grade 12s, please, what you have to do for you to get the answers correct, I'm really begging you, you have to read the stem. The stem in this case, I'm referring to the statement that is given because forever is 1.1. 1.1.1. 1.1, the statement will be given there. We refer to that statement as the stem. Then read this, cover the alternatives. We forever give 4 alternatives, A, B, C, D. Cover the 4 alternatives and read the stem, which is the instruction that is given there or the statement that is given in that question. While reading, think about, while reading this question and hiding the options, think about the possible correct answer for the stem that you've read. Then after thinking and maybe getting the correct one, possibly, uncover the 4 options and look for the options that are given there. Definitely you'll get the one that you thought it's correct. But sometimes some alternatives looks more correct than the one that you thought about. If that is the case, if you've got the correct one immediately, just circle it. If you are using the past papers and you are studying, I know you are using the past papers, you are studying, just circle the correct one. Then in a case, when the options comes in, you see almost 2 that you think one of them should be correct. Start eliminating that you think are completely not correct, meaning you'll eliminate the 2 that, and look at the last 2 that you're not sure which one is correct. Then look from the 2, look for the one that you think this should be the correct one. Somewhere you must get the correct one. Then I would advise you, in the multiple choice questions, please don't leave anything. Just please answer all the questions in 1.1. So let's see if you are able to answer the questions that are based, or that are the multiple choice question. We've got the next one, the question here that was taken from November, paper 1, 2019. So it says, which part of the neuron transmits impulse towards the cell body? We're talking the neuron. We know they transmit the impulse, but towards the cell body. Now, in your mind, what comes in your mind? There comes the structure of a neuron. Then, that's where now you're hiding all the alternatives, and you're thinking, which one will be correct? I know you are thinking. And definitely you've got the correct one. Let's see. There are the options. Question is, the transmission of impulse towards the cell body. Because now you know the structure, you will definitely know that it should be A. It should be A. Because A is the impulse is from the dendrites to the cell body before it goes to the axion. The next one. The stem says the nerve impulse in the axion of sensory neuron is transmitted. That's the stem. Nerve impulse in the axion of which neuron? Sensory neuron. You thinking. Axion of the sensory neuron transmitted. Let's see the options. What would be the option? You are thinking. This question is from DBE 2019. Then your answer in this case will be the last one. Because now is the impulse in the axion, already in the axion, of which neuron, sensory neuron, transmitted. It will be transmitted away from the cell body. The next question, going to move now. Because now we're looking at the stem here. The stem says the person can feel pain in his legs, but cannot move his leg. Then what comes into your mind? You're thinking of the reflex action and the reflex arc. The pain can be felt, meaning a processing took place, interpretation took place. What is left is the response. Then this is the result of damage of, we're looking at the options. Damage of which neuron? Let's see which neuron is damaged. Number C, the motor neuron. Because the motor neuron needs to transmit impulse to the effector for response to take place. So in this case, response did not take place. The next question, it's a new question now. We're looking at the diagram. Like I said at the beginning, when you see the diagram, study the diagram first. So you look at this diagram, we've got A, we've got B, we've got C, we've got E, that is the diagram. So you study the diagram first and read the question with understanding. The diagram represents the possible path followed by impulse when a person touches a hot plate. Immediately when you hear hot plate, what runs into your brain will be reflex action, reflex arc, and transmission of impulse. 3 neurons involved there. The one bringing the impulse, interpretation, taking impulse to the next one giving us response. Name the path represented in the diagram. So we're looking at the path. We've got that diagram here. We're looking at the path. Already when I was explaining, I was giving you the path. This is the reflex arc. That's the pathway of the impulse that is interpreted in the spinal cord. Identify the part of the neuron represented by B, C, and E. Then already you studied your diagram. So you'll be able to answer the diagram. We studied the types of neurons. You'll be able to answer this. Let's look at the identified type of a neuron represented by B. That will be your motor neuron. This would be your motor neuron. And then the neuron represented by C is the interneuron or connector neuron, multipolar or unipolar for the sensory neuron. These are the neurons that are represented by these letters according to the question. Then we move to the next question. Based on the same diagram, it says again, like I said, it says give the letter only. In this case, don't waste time writing the name. The question wants you just to write the letter. For the letter that represents the receptor. Receptor, because you are able to give the name of the neurons, you'll be able to give the letter that represents the receptor, which is now, if we look at this, this will be your F, where the stimuli is received. And then the effector will be represented by A, because this is the motor neuron that takes the impulse to the effector for response to take place. Then, part that has an insulating function. Remember, we've got the axion, the part where the impulse is traveling, and it's covered by that myelin sheath. Its function, it insulates, it protects the axion. So the part that has insulating function is the myelin sheath. Which letter? It's letter G, which is the myelin sheath. Still, questions based on the same diagram. Give the letter and the name, in this case, of the part, the region where impulses is transmitted chemically. Now you remember the neurotransmitters in the form of chemicals. Then you'll be able to answer this question. It's at this point where we said the neurons are not touching each other. That's where transmission of impulse is taking place. And it's letter D, and we call it the synapse. The part that has got insulating function. We did talk to the function of the myelin sheath, which will come here and say it's the letter G, which is the myelin sheath. Let's move now. We did the reflex arc. We did see the diagram there that shows the reflex arc, and reflex action. Now we have the diagram here. Almost the same diagram that I used to explain with the reflex arc and the reflex action. Remember, you study the diagram first, then you go to the question. The diagram represents the reflex arc. Yes, because we studied this. Give the letter and the name of the part that controls one directional transmission of impulse. Then here, we're looking at the synapse. Letter D. It says it controls one direction or directional transmission of impulse. It's D. Yes, it's where the synapse is taking place. Then the part that transmits impulse from the sensory neuron to the correct motor neuron? The answer there will be C, which is the interneuron or the connector neuron. The part that transmits impulse to the cell body. We did talk to that as the dendrites because they receive in there's neuron A, sensory neuron, the dendrites here, there is to the cell body of the sensory neuron receives the impulse. The question 4, based on the same diagram, we just give the letter of the neuron that is damaged when a person is able to feel pain but cannot respond to the stimuli. That would be your E. Why E? Because now we're talking about the neuron that is damaged where the person can feel where processing did take place, but what is the problem there is the response cannot take place. So that should be the motor neuron that goes to the effector, which is F. Already effector, now I answered, effector will be F. Then our exam guideline did say at the end of this, after studying the human response to the environment or human nervous system, we should look at the diseases that are related to. The first one is the Alzheimer's disease. This is the type of a disorder that is related to dementia. And then it is characterized by the loss of the neurons. Now that you know the functions of the neurons, that they transmit impulse, and then the loss of the synapses, meaning there is no transmission of impulse, then it meant this is happening in the cortex of the brain. Then we know that person has got a disease that is called the Alzheimer's disease. Remember, with the exam guidelines said we should study the causes. The causes are unknown. At this point, there is no cure for this, and this can lead to death. The symptoms, exam guidelines said we should know the symptoms. Symptoms of Alzheimer's diseases is the loss of brain functioning because there's no synapse that is taking place. The neuron is damaged, meaning impulse is not moving. So the symptoms will be slow thinking, behavioral change, confusion about the events, loss of memory, time and place, difficulty in recognizing, it goes with the memory, and then difficulty in speech or speaking, that goes to no coordination of the voluntary action, the cerebellum, the long one. So the second disease is the multiple sclerosis, multiple, meaning many. So here we're looking at the damage, many scars that are found in the myelin sheath. Remember, myelin sheath is important for insulation of the axon. Axon important for transmission of the impulse. Degenerative, it's a disorder that degenerates the central nervous system, the functioning of the central nervous system, and the optic nerve for eyesight. The causes, it is caused by autoimmune disease. Once again, we said auto meaning things that just happen without your control, above your control. Immune system, those are the cells in your body that fights infections in your body. So this multiple sclerosis is caused by the non-functioning of the immune system. So we use this diagram to show, we said from the beginning, multiple sclerosis, many scars or the damage of the insulation of the axon. So if you look at this diagram, we've got this neuron. It's a complete neuron. You see the axon is there. It is insulated. It's nicely covered by the myelin sheath. But when you go to the second neuron, we see the scars. Here, there's a space here, and there's a space here. It means we've got multiple scars or damages in the insulation part of the neuron, which is the myelin sheath. That is this neuron, when you look at this neuron, it is affected by multiple sclerosis. Then the symptoms of multiple sclerosis, it affects the movement. Remember, if the axon is not protected, it won't do its function, and it won't perform its function of transmitting impulse. So the vision and numbness of the body, the muscle weakness and spasma that will cause pain, fatigue forever, bladder and bowel problems, pains in your system, and it affects your concentration and memory loss and the mood swings. These are the type of questions that can be asked on the diseases that affect the central nervous system. And this question was taken from Prelim Free State 2018, paper 1. Again, we're looking at the diagram first. Once you see the diagram, you study the diagram. They told us that this is the axon, the pathway for impulse. And it is insulated, covered, and protected by the myelin sheath. The second one, look at this, it's damaged. So we know once we see this, this should be multiple sclerosis disorder. The diagram represents part of the neuron that became damaged due to particular disease in humans. Identify the disease. You will be able to identify disease because you can see the scars or the damage in the myelin sheath. Then the answer there will be multiple sclerosis or MS. Give one visible reason. Already when we were studying the diagram, we were looking at this, and we saw that the myelin sheath is damaged. But let's see how the examiner expects us to put the answer. Damaged or broken myelin sheath. And then the other one, we move to the next question, still based on the same diagram. It says, name one effect that this disease will have on the nervous system. Remember, we did we look at the symptoms. Less electrical insulation occurs between the neuron. Electrical insulation that's between the neurons, there is no transmission, less transmission of impulse from one neuron to another. Then this will decrease the speed of transmission of impulses. These are the possible answers for this. Even if the question said one, we cannot just give one. We give all the answers that can answer this question. But if you are writing exam grade 12, if they say one, just give one, because we'll take one. Because the question wants you to take one. At the end of this lesson now, I want us to recap what we've studied. We studied human nervous system. Then we said human nervous system consists of central, I put it in the middle, central nervous system that consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then around the spinal cord, the central nervous system, we've got the peripheral nervous system. Those are the nerves around the central nervous system, around the spinal cord and the cranium. And then it's further divided into, these are the nerves that form the peripheral nervous system and their functions. And the peripheral nervous system, the one that we're dealing with, is only the autonomic nervous system. That consists of the parasympathetic, you pause, and the sympathetic, it's there. The time that you need it's now the time where the blood will be, example that I used, it's more blood that will be pumped into your muscles to run away. Sympathetic, your sympathy, but the body needs to protect you. Sympathetic nervous system and all the functions that I put forward. So this is but the recap of what we've studied. Grade 12, I believe you did write information on this, you've got questions, and you'll be able to answer questions based on this. So when we finish this, I believe now at home, we are facing this pandemic. I know you are keeping safe, you are studying, you are doing the best out of this. Keep safe, keep studying, focus, you're going to make it, and you're going to make it strong. Thank you. Then we look at our former president, the quotation from our former president. Thank you so much, grade 12. Good luck. all of the best. Thank you.